Hello, fellow readers and booktubers. It's time to post the next installment or the next episode of my Roman history, Roman Emperors Reading Challenge. The last post, I wrapped up with some final words about the Emperor Tiberius, and so now it's time to move on to Caligula. Historically, one of the more infamous of the Roman emperors, although not the only one. There have been some pretty bad emperors out there who had some strange behaviors. But Caligula is particularly infamous for this. He was the third of the Roman emperors, the second of the Julio-Claudians. If you recall, the first emperor was Augustus, and then he establishes this dynasty known as the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So then the second emperor was Tiberius, the first of the Julio-Claudians, and now the third emperor, Caligula, is the second of the Julio-Claudian. Our main sources for information about Caligula, our main ancient sources, are Dio Cassius, who wrote a history of Rome. He wrote this about 100 years after Caligula's time. Dio Cassius's work must have been magnificent. Not a lot of it survives. What does survive is really interesting, and parts of what he wrote do include the reign of Caligula. So we can draw on some Dio Cassius. And then, of course, there's Suetonius, probably the more famous source. And he was writing almost a century after the fact. But he is our most complete source of information. But the issue with Suetonius is, how reliable is he? And we'll get into that towards the end of this post. And then there's Tacitus, perhaps one of the greatest of the Roman historians. He's also writing after the fact, but not too long after the fact. There might have been some people around when Tacitus was writing his history of Rome who might have been eyewitnesses to the reign of Caligula. So he had some information to draw from there. And then there's Seneca, the Roman philosopher and statesman who absolutely knew Caligula. Now, I should mention that these sources, they have information, or they're drawing on sources that are long lost to us. So, they've got access to archives and things that we just don't have. But nonetheless, those are the four major Roman sources we have: Dio Cassius, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Seneca. But there are two other sources, not Roman sources, but these are Jewish historians. There is Josephus, the famous Josephus, who had witnessed the destruction of the temple in the year 70. He was a child when Caligula had died. But again, he would have had access to information. He would have been able to encounter people who remember the reign of Caligula quite clearly. And then there's Philo of Alexandria. He was an Alexandrian Jew. These were Jews who were almost thoroughly Hellenized. They lived in Alexandria of Egypt. He was a teenager when Caligula ruled. So Philo, might have remembered stuff, or he certainly know people who had very fresh memories of being in the court of Caligula and all of this. Caligula's Roman name is Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. He was born in the year 12, sometimes toward the end of August, and he'll be dead by the year 41 at the age of 29. He will be assassinated by the Praetorians. So anyway, his full name is Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but he's best remembered to history as Caligula. This was an endearment, a nickname he was given when he was very, very young. The word Caligula means little boots, or I guess you could translate it as bootsy, which is kind of ironic given the reputation he will have. Bootsy the murderer, Bootsy the deviant. But nonetheless, this is the name he was given when he was young. His father was a military commander, and when he was on campaign, he brought his family with him, his wife and his children. And Gaius, the youngest, became kind of the mascot of the legions. And so his mother made him a miniature Roman military uniform, complete with Roman standard issue boots. But these were smaller size boots for a little kid. So you get from that little boots, Bootsy or Caligula. His father, by the way, was Germanicus, who was the grandson of Mark Antony. And his mother was Agrippina, the elder, who was the granddaughter of Augustus himself. So Caligula was born into a very powerful family. He was born into the higher aristocracy of Rome, born into incredible privilege. When he was a child, the emperor at that time was Tiberius. Tiberius and Caligula's father, Germanicus, were kind of at odds with each other, although it seems like this was mostly as a result of Tiberius's own paranoia. Caligula's father, Germanicus, was incredibly popular with the Romans, very popular with his troops. Germanicus had led a very successful military campaign in Germany. Back in Rome, Tiberius was very jealous and perhaps fearful that maybe Germanicus, his rival for power, might march on Rome and take over. Germanicus, we're told, did a lot to try to calm Tiberius's fears in this regard, but that just made Tiberius more suspicious. At one point, Germanicus was dispatched to the east, and the Roman governor of Syria at that time was a guy by the name of Piso, who had been appointed by Tiberius. And while Germanicus was in the east, he became very ill. And he came to believe or confide in his family and friends that he thought he had been poisoned by Piso, and that Piso was acting under orders of Tiberius. And then Germanicus died. A great mourning in Rome over this. Now, did Tiberius was Germanicus poisoned? We don't know for sure. If he was poisoned, did Tiberius have anything to do with this? Again, we don't know. But, the fact that this rumor made the rounds and it still is discussed to this day reminds us that at this time in Roman history, in fact, all throughout Roman history, politics was a blood sport. Removing your rivals either through, outright murder or poisonings or damaging someone's reputation so completely they would have to exile themselves. These things were unfortunately fairly common. And when you have an emperor like Tiberius who had become so incredibly paranoid and fearful, and kind of with good reason, there had been a number of conspiracies against them. But when you have an emperor like that, there are going to be assassinations and murders and poisonings and all the rest. Tiberius, near the end of his reign, he had really come to believe that he was under danger. There were conspiracies. There were threats of there was treason. There were conspiracy trials, political rivalries, and in fact, even Caligula's mother, Agrippina, was banished. Caligula was put under the charge of his increasingly paranoid uncle Tiberius. Tiberius, at one point, things had gotten so bad, he'd become so suspicious and at odds with his own people that he kind of exiled himself to a villa on the island of Capri, which is, maybe 60 miles south of Rome. You can see the villa is still there. It's on top of a cliff. It's really quite the site. It's a tourist destination. But Tiberius had closed himself off from the rest of Rome. And then when he found out his confidant Sejanus was actually conspiring against Tiberius, that was it. Tiberius, he trusted no one. But he kept Caligula close by. And we don't know why. There is some conjecture about that. I'll get into that a little bit later. But Tiberius, his nephew, Caligula was his nephew. Tiberius kept the kid, who was very young at the time, close by on the island of Capri. Who would be the successor? We don't, Tiberius was very tight-lipped about this kind of thing. He didn't make up his mind until essentially he was on his deathbed. That was very much in keeping with Tiberius. He often vacillated, or he would obscure what he was truly thinking. Again, that's a result of his deep paranoia. But on his deathbed, he seemed to have made it pretty clear that he wanted his nephew Caligula to succeed him. Tiberius did have a grandson, Gemellus, who was about 7 years younger than Caligula. A lot of people thought that Tiberius would give the title of emperor to his grandson, but at the last minute he gives it to Caligula. We're not sure what he was thinking. Again, there's some conjecture about this. Maybe he was, Tiberius, we are told, recognized in Caligula something rather depraved about the young man, but maybe he was thinking to use Caligula as kind of a placeholder until Gemellus, his grandson, could come of age, then eliminate Caligula, and then Gemellus would be the next emperor. Of course, it didn't work out that way. But we just don't know. It's a very curious thing. But, Tiberius dies, and Caligula is now the next emperor. Tiberius died in the year 37 at the age of 77. Okay? Tacitus and Cassius Dio and Suetonius intimate that Caligula had something to do with the death of Tiberius. Tiberius was already quite ill, and at the age of 77 in the first century, that's elderly. The fact that he was on his deathbed already, no one disputes that. But did Caligula do something to speed things along? We are told that he was suffocated by Caligula himself. What's interesting about this, some of the earlier historians, particularly Philo and Josephus, they just say that Caligula died of, or that Tiberius died of natural causes. So there's some mystery surrounding this. Did Caligula kill his uncle or speed up Tiberius's end? Or did Tiberius just die of natural causes and Caligula was then hailed as the new emperor? But in a very short amount of time, Caligula enters the city of Rome, and with the consensus of the three orders, that would be the Senate, the equestrians, and the people, the Senate conferred on Caligula the right and power to decide on all affairs. Caligula was 25 years old at the time, okay? A virtual unknown in Roman political life, no military service. When he was with the military, he was a child. He was with his father, who was commanding the troops. But he was granted the same authority and power that Augustus had accumulated, that had been passed on to Tiberius. And now it's passed on to the young Caligula, okay? He was now entitled to make or break or ignore any law that he wanted to. One of the first things he did was ask the Senate to confer divine honors on Tiberius. The Senate refused to do that. Tiberius had been at such odds with the Senate and had been responsible for the death of so many senators. The Senate was not about to name Tiberius a god. But Caligula, at his own expense, did put on a magnificent funeral for his uncle. And he was met with a great popular approval for this because it was a big party, and the Romans loved a party, okay? And this was followed by another early act of Caligula to put on a massive festival. Games, gladiatorial combats, chariot races, free food, enormous festivals, really over the top with this kind of stuff. Then from that point on, for about the first 2 years of Caligula's short 4-year reign, he was beloved by the people. Philo of Alexandria says that Caligula in these early days was universally admired. Caligula's reign was the golden age of happiness and prosperity. Even Suetonius will say that initially Caligula was loved by many, and one of the reasons for this is that he was the son of Germanicus, whose memory was greatly revered by the Romans, and who the Romans loved dearly. And Josephus claims that in the first 2 years of Caligula's reign, quote, he was high-minded and even-handed in his rule, and he earned goodwill throughout the empire. And particularly with the people of Rome, Caligula had a love for common entertainment, for the popular passions, for gambling, chariot races, public spectacles, gladiatorial contests, horse racing, the theater, gambling, and he would put on these festivals, these bread and circuses, as they were called, or as they were known, at a level and with an extravagance that no one else could possibly match, because in essence, Caligula had unlimited resources, okay? And he had a fondness for the grandiose, bigger than life. In fact, he engaged in a lot of major building projects, some of which were engaged in for the benefit of the Roman people, to entertain them, and others were just to kind of shore up some temples that were collapsing, all this. And again, at great expense. Among the building projects here, he completed the Temple of Augustus. He restored the Theater of Pompey. They had cleared ground for an amphitheater. They dug the foundations, the big open pit. But before the amphitheater was built, Caligula had it filled with water, and he had ships sailing out on this man-made lake to put on kind of mock naval battles with gladiators fighting on the ships. Oh, they were fighting to the death. But the Roman people loved this kind of stuff. He loved these things. He oversaw the building of a couple of new aqueducts to bring some fresh water into the city. These aqueducts were considered marvels of engineering at the time. Even outside of Italy, in Syracuse on Sicily, he repaired the city walls and the temples there. He even started or he had he wanted to build a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth. This was in Greece. Julius Caesar had planned to do this, and later kings, even in the Middle Ages, would always try to cut through the Isthmus of Corinth to build a canal to connect northern Greece with southern Greece. Caligula had sent Roman engineers to get that job done. Unfortunately, it was never completed, but had it been completed, it would have been another engineering marvel. And Caligula is really encouraging this stuff. And he seemed to have taken his religious duties very seriously as well. I would remind you, there's no separation of church and state at this time. Church and state are one. Of course, I'm kind of using those terms in an anachronistic fashion. But the cultic beliefs of Rome and its strength as a political entity were all bound up with one thing. The state was strong so long as the gods were properly worshipped and acknowledged, even though by Caligula's time there's some reason to believe a little bit of cynicism had crept in among the upper classes. But nonetheless, he made sure that the priestly colleges were well maintained. Some of them had kind of fallen into decrepitude, but he appointed new priests for the College of Mars and for the Temple of Diana. He also made sure that they finished the Temple of Apollo in Greece, which was only about half done at that time, but it was completed under Caligula's orders. So, this shows he was a man of great piety. He understood the importance of the gods. Great building projects, magnificent entertainments for the people. How could anyone go wrong in this? But somewhere halfway through his 4-year reign, after the second year, something did go wrong. Something went disastrously wrong. Suetonius tells us that there had been a conspiracy, but he gives us no information about who the conspirators were or what exactly it was they were trying to do. It is strongly intimated that it had to do with the Roman aristocracy and the Roman senators. Okay, in fact, in Suetonius, there's a very famous line in Suetonius in his biography of Caligula. The first half of it, Caligula is wonderful, everybody loves him. And then Suetonius puts in this line. There's a couple of different translations of this, but I'll use this one. It goes, in Suetonius, part 22 in his life of Caligula, he goes, "Thus far we have spoken of him as a prince. What remains to be said of him reveals him more a monster than a man." And now you get the horror show. And what you get from Suetonius is just this litany of moments which portray Caligula or reveal Caligula to be a dangerously disturbed man, impulsive, lawless, violent, deviant in his private life. In fact, Suetonius will even tell us that even before Caligula became emperor, when he was living in Capri with his uncle Tiberius, and Tiberius would be torturing suspected criminals and conspirators and that, Caligula took special joy in watching these tortures and maybe even took part in them himself. And of course, Suetonius intimates that Caligula had incestuous relationships with his sisters. Then after he became emperor, the kind of money he was spending on these entertainments, he was squandering the royal coffers. In fact, at one point, he had created a major deficit in Rome, and so he confiscated the estates of the wealthy aristocrats, and sometimes using false accusations, fining them exorbitantly, just so he could pay off the huge debt he incurred by putting on these extravagant, irresponsible festivities, okay? Which, of course, strained relations between Caligula and the Senate. And then there were numerous purges. One big conspiracy, again, we don't know what it was about, but a couple little ones after that. Caligula had total disdain for the Senate, and Suetonius doesn't really explain this, but Suetonius or Caligula never passed up an opportunity to show his disdain for the Senate and his disrespect for them, even to the point of naming his horse a senator and building a marble stable for the horse and feeding the horse oats that were sprinkled with gold and all of this, and he would hail his horse as the senator. And of course, Suetonius says, well, this is the act of a madman. Okay, and then there's the infamous military expedition in Germany, with a baggage train that supposedly included actors and gladiators and prostitutes. In the spring of around the year 40 or so, Caligula tried to extend Roman rule into Britain, lined up the legions along along the shore of the English Channel. And then he gets into a boat and he crosses himself. And then he returns, and the legions didn't go with him. And so he orders them to fill their helmets with seashells. And these are the spoils of the sea. What is Caligula thinking here? Did he think he had defeated Neptune in some way? Just this irresponsible behavior, even towards the legions, forcing them to march and countermarch with no discernible purpose, shames the legions, leading to further charges that Caligula was a madman. And then there were the thing which led many people to conclude that Suetonius had lost his mind is when he declared himself to be a god, or even a goddess. He would show up dressed as various gods and goddesses at public spectacles and state dinners and things like this. And then there are many, many other things that here's Suetonius' famous work, by the way. It's called The 12 Caesars. It's short biographies of Julius Caesar and then the first 11 Roman emperors. And it's from Suetonius mostly that we get the really outrageous stories about Caligula, and a lot of other things too, troubling sexual escapades, random executions of people for no reason other than that Caligula could order someone's death, and so he did it for kicks. And taken together, you get this picture of a very, very disturbed young man. And that's how history has remembered Caligula for 2 millennia. However, occasionally there are some historians who will look at what the ancient stories have to tell us and look at those a little more carefully, and they start to raise some objections, or at least some suspicion that perhaps Caligula wasn't the mad emperor. These things that he had done when he was emperor, perhaps these things were just taken out of context and presented in such a way as to make Caligula look bad. One of those historians is Aloys Winterling, in his more recent book, A Biography of Caligula. Winterling is the chair of ancient history at Humboldt University in Berlin. He's authored other books about Roman history, but this is his book, Caligula. It was published in 2011. And he argues that perhaps Caligula wasn't the monster that that history has made him out to be. But these things that Caligula did were just wildly taken out of context. For example, it was claimed by Suetonius that Caligula had incestuous relationships with his sisters. But Suetonius is the first historian to say this. Before Suetonius, decades earlier, people who knew Caligula personally, like Seneca, they never mentioned anything about this. And a lot of those guys, like Seneca, didn't really like Caligula. So, if Caligula was engaged in activity like this would be the kind of stuff you would mention. But they don't mention it. Suetonius is the first one to mention this. Winterling, in his book, says, well, there's reason then to doubt that story. Now, of course, Suetonius may have had information lost to us that he was drawing on, or perhaps, for whatever reason, he's just reporting on gossip and rumor. In fact, Suetonius was kind of known for that. He was a sensationalist. He loved gossip, especially about the rich and powerful, and he was more than happy to repeat, vicious rumors. So you got that. Also, Winterling, in his kind of revisionist view of Caligula, he talks about how, Suetonius tells us that when Tiberius was torturing people, Caligula liked to watch that stuff. He seemed to take pleasure in it. On the other hand, at this time, it was the atmosphere in Rome and on the island of Capri was either kill or be killed. If you showed any kind of negative criticism or negative reaction to Tiberius's action, you might be the next one executed. So Caligula may have been pretending to enjoy these things so Tiberius wouldn't become suspicious of the young man. Perhaps a bit of a stretch there, but it kind of makes sense. Because Caligula, when he does become emperor, he is very careful he does order the execution of many of his political rivals, including the grandson of Tiberius Gemellus. But again, politics was blood sport in Rome. This execution of political rivals was not a sign of insanity. It was a sign of political expediency, practicality, realpolitik. So the fact that Caligula did this, not unusual. And the fact that he may have been disgusted by Tiberius as torturing people to death, but the fact that he would hide that to protect himself, isn't that much of a stretch to argue that, okay? Winterling notes that when Caligula became emperor, he was only 25. Tiberius was 56 when he became emperor. Augustus had fought in continual civil wars for decades before he was able to consolidate his power. Now you've got this young guy in office. There's no precedent. There's no handbook of how to be an emperor. In fact, being an emperor was something of a legal fiction. So Caligula is this young kid, and he's got everything handed to him, okay? And he quickly burns through the family fortune by putting on these elaborate contests, which Suetonius and historians after Suetonius would say were signs of Caligula's gross irresponsibility and his inability to understand the consequence of his actions. Winterling says, hold on a second. Caligula was a young aristocrat. Putting on these parties at that age, it's like his coming out party. Young aristocrats, when they first reached adulthood, they were expected to put on elaborate games, gladiatorial combats, chariot races, and these young aristocrats would often take part in these things. They were expected to be, overspend, all right? The fact that Caligula did this is very much in keeping with his social status. The fact that he overdid it, though, is just because he is not simply a Roman aristocrat. He is of the house of the Julio-Claudians. He has to put on games and entertainments that far exceed anything Rome had ever seen before, because he couldn't risk having another young aristocrat come along and put on games that were even more elaborate, because it would make Caligula look weak. And if he looked weak, he might get killed. People might not respect his power as the true emperor of Rome. And so, whereas Suetonius and others see Caligula's spending as gross and irresponsible, Winterling says, no, it's a political calculation. It makes absolute sense, all right? And then the expedition into Germany. Winterling says, if you read the sources on this, there had been a possible attempted coup led by the military commander in Upper Germany, and Caligula had rushed north to crush that thing, and then to shore up the legions in the north. Just across the Danube there, you've got these Germanic tribes that are always pushing into Roman territory, and the legions had become rather lax. Caligula's presence there got them to pull their act together. This wasn't just some random expedition that Caligula wanted to engage in just for kicks. There was a purpose for it. And that idea of crossing the English Channel to conquer Britain, the troops, the island of Britain in Roman myth, until the island was conquered by the Romans, it was this weird land of magic and monsters and everything else. There had been, notice that there had been times when legions were expected to march into these strange lands, and they would refuse to go. Caligula's legions refused to cross the channel because of their own superstition. And so Caligula ordering them to pick seashells as their war booty was just a way of humiliating them, saying, you guys are just a bunch of cowards. Collect the seashells. There's your reward. So this wasn't necessarily the act of a lunatic. This was an act of a man who was just frustrated and fed up with his legions not obeying him. And why weren't they obeying him? Probably because he was so young. All right? And then, the thing that I think Suetonius really points to as a sign that Caligula was insane was when Caligula declared himself to be a god. And he began to dress up as various Roman gods and goddesses when he was in public or at state dinners and this kind of thing. And Suetonius and historians after Suetonius said, this is a sure sign that Caligula was insane. He believed himself to be a god. Winterling says, hold on a second. There's a lot of intimation that Caligula was perhaps pondering the idea of creating a Roman monarchy, of making himself a king. Now, by this time in history, the Romans had no experience with monarchs, with kings, except in the East. That would have been the model of monarchy, these Hellenistic kings. And the Hellenistic kings all believed, or were believed to be, of divine blood. Okay? And these Hellenistic kings would often dress up like the gods that they admired. So perhaps Caligula is just imitating an Eastern monarch by dressing up as a god. There's no evidence. There are no coins that depict Caligula as a god. There are no royal proclamations where he is hailed as a god. He was just imitating these Eastern kings by dressing up as a god. And as a matter of fact, Augustus had a fancy dinner party. What was it called? The Festival of the 12 Gods. And Augustus dressed up like Jupiter. This idea of dressing up as a god, if you're a wealthy aristocrat, wasn't a sign of madness. It could have been a sign of respect for the gods, or maybe kind of an ironic, poking fun at the cultic system. Or in Caligula's case, it could have just been he was imitating the Eastern kings, the kings of the Hellenistic kingdoms. There's no evidence that Caligula actually thought of himself as a god. So what's going on here? Winterling says the idea of Caligula being the mad emperor, that begins with Suetonius, and it sticks. And all the historians after Suetonius repeat this stuff. The sources we have prior to Suetonius, Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, Tacitus to a degree, and Seneca in particular, they don't say anything about this kind of stuff. They may refer to Caligula as, oh, he's crazy, but they don't mean that he's mentally ill. They just mean, oh, he's a young kid. Oh, he threw a party that cost $20 billion. That's crazy stuff. They're not saying he's mentally ill. They're using it in the same way we would use it. If someone does something unexpected or unpredictable, he's saying, that guy's crazy. No, it's Suetonius that's saying that Caligula was actually insane, all right? Who he starts this thing. The question then is, why would Suetonius want posterity to think of Caligula as insane? Here, Winterling's argument gets a little thin, but it kind of makes sense. When Suetonius was writing his Lives of the Caesars, it was in the early 2nd century, mid-2nd century, I guess. And it was a time when the Roman Empire was knowing a degree of political stability. There had been a series of emperors, the 5 good emperors, they were called, beginning with Nerva, going through to Marcus Aurelius. And these guys were aristocrats. They were known for their stability, their even-handedness, and all of this. So Suetonius, writing his Lives of the 12 Caesars, he gets to this young kid, Caligula, who did outrageous, immature things. Of course, he was young. And how is he going to explain this? And of course, Caligula's hatred for the Senate and the aristocracy. So Winterling argues that what Suetonius did was he smears Caligula's reputation rather than have to explain why this powerful emperor hated the aristocracy so much, because the aristocracy was so corrupt. The aristocracy now controls Rome in Suetonius's time. So he had to make Caligula look extra bad. I'm not sure I buy that argument, but still the fact remains that this image of Caligula as the mad emperor, it begins with Suetonius, who's writing 100 years after the fact. What was Suetonius doing here? Why did he do this? Or maybe he did have information that we don't have that did make Caligula look crazy. I don't know. We'll probably never know, but do be aware, whenever you read accounts of Caligula as the mad emperor and these crazy things that he does, that there is a counterpoint to that. There is a revisionist view, and that can be very convincing at times. And Winterling is pretty good at this. Now, of course, Caligula will be assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, and that's an entirely different story, which then leads into the next of the Roman emperors, Claudius. So I'm going to save the story of Caligula's assassination as the entry point into the next post of the life of the Emperor Claudius. So anyway, that's Caligula. Interesting character. They all were. And this is Winterling's book. And this is also Suetonius. I think some of you may have read this. A good source of information, although perhaps not the most reliable. So that's Caligula. And that is the end of this episode in my Emperor's Reading Challenge. And very soon, I'll be putting up a post regarding the next Emperor Claudius. That's it. Have a good day. Take care of yourselves and never stop reading.